Well, thank you for joining us in this second day of the Design Research Week panel on data embodiment. We'll discover what that means during the end of the presentations, but the basic idea was to share the different ways faculty here in Northeastern, but also in other universities as links that starting from one of our partners, the Harvard Mental Lab, are playing with data, meaning different ways and modalities of transforming data into meaningful experiences. When it's about data, usually it's mostly visual what we think. So it's something that like data visualization is probably one of the most common modalities or most often mentioned modalities of transforming data to make sense of it. But we are exploring here in Northeastern and other people elsewhere other ways and other modalities like data sonification or data physicalization that brings their own value to that, but still we see this kind of separation between the different modalities that maybe doesn't really make so much sense, even that as the data embodiment concept I think expresses, we experience the world holistically, all our body, all our senses together. So does it really make sense when we represent something of the world to separate the senses and to treat them like separately? So my goal here, like personal goal here, would be to understand more if there are potential synergies, if there are ways to reconnect all these senses, all these modalities, and create really experiences that embrace this idea of the way we experience the world holistically and bring that into the way we design experiences for data. So that would be my personal goal. I don't know about the others, but you have your time to discuss your perspective on that. And thank you all the panelists for joining. We will start with Lynn Sterry from Medalab Harvard, and then move to Dietmar Offenhuber, chair of the Pattern Design Department here at Northeastern, Petrus Roots, faculty, co-faculty member of the Center for Design, former director of the IDD program, coordinator, how do you say that, of the IDD program? Pat. Great. And Sarah Lindsay, Tildel's Critical Alarms Lab, that together with me and other people here, helped setting up the Data Sonification Archive initiative. And we have Stephanie Polsky from from Northeastern, and I think we can get started. Linz, take it away.
Terrific. I'm Lynn Sterry, a principal at MetaLab at Harvard, an experimental laboratory working at the intersection of the arts, humanities, and technology. My work centers on looking at how choreography models pertaining to the body, movement, time, and space can be applied to different design processes, specifically those in human-computer interaction, working around the concept of choreographic interfaces, and also in the area of data visualization, working on the topic or working on the concept of data embodiment. Title of this talk, Data Embodiment, Approaching the Body as a Choreographic Medium for Performing Abstract Data. This is also the title of a recent paper that I will be drawing quite heavily upon. It's a jam-packed paper that really covers placing the idea of data embodiment in the data design or data communication sphere, also thinking about data embodiment in performance practice, and then lastly, covering my own experiment of choreographing a data set, which will end here in a moment. All right, the idea of choreographing a data set, where it came from, and how this got me thinking about data embodiment. I took a course at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in data visualization, and it became apparent that the decisioning around how to visualize data is similar to the decisioning or the composition of how a choreographer would organize bodies on stage, and left me with the thought of why not choreograph a data set. And I would say the impulse to be experimental and avant-garde was inspired by interacting with Paulo and Dietmar at MetaLab, who introduced me to the spaces of data sonification, data physicalization, and so forth, and thought I would take a go at it. Loved Paulo's introduction on what data embodiment means to him. To me, I define it as a communicative and artistic method that approaches the body as a choreographic medium to physicalize and perform abstract data. And where I was coming from in defining it as such was thinking about how there's a gap in data communication where visual, oral, and haptic media are used for data visualization, data sonification, and data physicalization, respectively, the gap being the use of a kinesthetic medium for data embodiment. And I'm not the first to use the term data embodiment, but perhaps this working definition is unique. In reflection, I'm almost thinking maybe it should be termed data kinesthetics or something like that. But maybe the different approach is that rather than thinking of embodiment as how we experience data, thinking about embodiment in terms of how data can be expressed, how data can be performed. And this is coming from my dance background. Moving abstract data off the page and into the world of bodies, those different practices I just mentioned, there is a common impulse to do this. And I would say what is in common between all of them is thinking about accessibility and different learning and memory modalities. We are more than just our eyeballs. We have all these sensory capabilities, and by designing data in various ways, we can reach the body in all of its capacity. Here's a great data physicalization example, living map, I wanted to put forth in case you're not familiar with the practice. I'll leave it here because I'm sure Dietmar or others who will be presenting today can better capture this area of expertise. All right, so moving on to thinking of the body as a choreographic medium for data embodiment. And I will just mention one fantastic example that I came across. This is a performance work titled 100% City by Rimini Protocol. And it was analyzed beautifully by Jorn Hertien as computer augmented human data embodiment. Essentially, 100 people were selected to represent the statistical data of a given city. And the staging or the choreography was a repetitive exercise of data frequency, yes, no, or in this case, me, not me. And so as these questions were asked of these actors / citizens of the city, they would, like, for instance, if you, I don't know, make above X amount of income, you'd go to the right side of the stage. And if you didn't, you go to the other side. And what was really powerful about this is that it even went beyond the simple frequencies of yes, no. Hertien explains the performer's bodies naturally encode demographic variables like gender and age that are easy to discover and always co-present. So while the organization was quite simple, it became this gorgeous data embodiment on quite a complex level. When thinking about data embodiment, a trend that came up when looking across different examples, including my own practice, was the tendency to want to embody data sets about people. And this makes sense. We are taking information from the world of bodies, abstracting it down to the page, and then naturally, this idea of data embodiment, bringing it back into movement, back into time and space. We want to work with data about people, but this brings up just some ethical questions about where do the data come from? And what are the ethics of embodying others' data that are collected through surveillance technologies, for example? And if a project sustainably benefits the population it embodies, Does it make the project more ethical despite how the performed data are sourced? Essentially, I think there's an important question about where the data come from, and oftentimes the data about moving bodies is coming from technologies that are tracking and are therefore surveillance. Had some success in finding some examples of data embodiment, maybe not called as such, in these experimental spaces, whether it was even at Northeastern, at the Data Culture Project, doing a really cool experiment of workshopping, performing data. Sorry, didn't mean to pull out this example right here, but let me just move forward and just go on to say that thinking about data embodiment specifically in the dance bubble of the performing arts, the examples were more limited. So this kind of made me think about the topic when researching it from the lens of how choreographers are framing dance's specific movement and ideas as data. How are dances drawn, or how are dances may be translated into data sets or translated into data visualizations? And the reason why this question was important for me to discover was because there's a bidirectionality. So thinking of it as, if I want to perform a data set, I might choose like this. And then if I want to translate a gesture like this into a data set, it creates this bidirectionality. Here is a data visualization. This came from a work called the Synchronous Objects Project by Ohio State University and the Forsyth Company. And in this project, a team of interdisciplinary researchers took as their source material a dance film from William Forsyth's One Flat Thing Reproduced, and created various choreographic objects. This one examined how complex the cueing system among dancers was across the choreography. And there were various types of choreographic objects that spanned information visualizations, animations, and computer applications. Here's another data visualization, again, translating choreographic ideas. This is an interactive network of Catherine Dunham's company repertory. So looking at the different units of choreography, from something small, like a small dance phrase, to a larger, perhaps basically different units of choreography, and how they ended up in all these different productions and dances. And this remixing of the different units of choreography that was revealed through the data visualization really showed, as the researchers Kate Elswit and Harmony Bench showed, how Catherine Dunham, the choreographer, was actually constantly remixing her works as a mode of adaptability and creativity. All right, so if we can visualize a dance, then we can also take visualized data and bring it back into a dance. And as I referenced, this bidirectionality is something I wanted to investigate in choreographing a data set. And I did this by creating a work called Data Sensorium at MetaLab. And we'll review this quickly. Decided to work with a data set from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and the data set focused on displacement caused by various disasters and internal migration. So specifically when people have to move from their homes within their country or territory due to environmental disasters like floods, fires, hurricanes, etc. And my impulse to work with this data set was, one, the connection of bodies. It's a data set about bodies connecting to, the connection of migratory bodies to dancing bodies felt very organic. And also the hazard types, as I mentioned, flood, volcano, earthquake, would relate well to different movement metaphors. So I thought I could really choreograph a flood gesture, for instance. It was tactile and visceral. And lastly, I wanted to choose a data set that would allow me to raise awareness about an important issue, this being the connection between climate change and disaster displacement. So began with a simple assignment for myself, which was to create gestures for the different disaster categories, which you can see here. And then once the gestures were created, expanded those gestures into small bits of movements, into larger expanded phrase work, and eventually into scores for improvisation. And this will make sense when we get to a short video of the work. This was a data dashboard that is projected on one wall during the dance. And the dashboard includes the movement score on the top left. And the movement score in many ways is inspired by the stacked area chart in the bottom left. And because the movement score ended up give a simple example, the way it had to transform so that it could be danced, since a stacked area chart did not lend itself well to dancing immediately, was needing to be logarithmically, what am I looking for? It had to be logarithmically changed. So to be able to portray 984,564 human displacements or population displacements would have been pretty much impossible on stage. So we logarithmically changed that into 4 steps forward. And the ring chart on the top left is a better representation of the movement score. In the bottom right is a choreographic interface that was used to help increase data and dance literacy. So the choreographic interface was able to read the gestures seen on the previous slide, these ones, and was able to project an overlaid skeleton and vocabulary. So whenever the dancer would hit that data gesture, it could be seen here. All right, a little bit of a meta explanation, since as you see, my improvised presentation is often a little unclear.
The simplest way to explain the movement score is the gestures represent the different disaster types. The repetition of the gestures correlates to the number of disasters per year being danced, and the steps moving forward from upstage to downstage relates to the number of people internally displaced by those disasters. These next short excerpts will really just help tune your eye into being able to see that choreographic development of not only the gestures and steps, the basic building units of the movement score, but also how the movement score ends up becoming expanded and transformed throughout the dance.
Sorry, Linz, to cut you, but no, technically we're out of time for your presentation. Do you want to close somehow? Then we can go back to the examples maybe during the conversation and the Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. Do you just want to do one last shout out and we can come back to this, only to point out the other work around data embodiment, dance theater here happening at Northeastern. And we can definitely come back to the slide if people are interested in discussing these other projects.
I'm glad we have you here. That's mentioned in that slide. Okay, great. Thank you, Linz. Dietmar.
Hello, everyone from Austria. Yeah, thanks, Linz, for this wonderful update on your work. It was really great to see. So let me briefly share the screen. So imagine the following situation that you find yourself outside and you have forgotten your smartphone. What a joy. But you somehow get the sense that it's soon going to start to rain. How would you know that? Can be different things, you know, we might see certain clouds or something going on in the sky. We might hear the birds behave differently. The air might feel different on our skin. Or as we step on dry grass, it may sound a little bit more muted. So the point is that in the material world, there are always multiple clues that give us the same information. This gentleman here is the sound artist Sam Auinger. I've been collaborating with him since the late 1990s, and I'm currently working on a new book with him on sonic thinking, how we can think with our ears and can use it to make sense of our environment. And this very point about the environment always giving us clues that are somehow aligned, that give us the same information, is something that is very, very different in the world of data physicalization, visualization, and sonification. So in my view, those three, data sonification, visualization, and physicalization, as they are practiced today, are pretty much exactly the same thing. They are always based on this same principle that you map data to a certain kind of perceptual quality, whether it's a visual mark or a sonic parameter or a material quality. So a number like 42 could be mapped to, you know, a bar of a specific length, or a tone with a certain pitch, or a cuboid with a certain proportion. And this was very deliberate. Jacques Bertin is like a cartographer who, you know, just like established this field of cartographic communication theory, which was very influential for data visualization, called this like a monosemic mapping, where every feature has exactly one sensory variable on the other side. So data are always unambiguously mapped and there's no redundancy. So in a way, this is something that comes also from the world of formal languages like mathematics, where you try to avoid redundancy, basically. And strangely enough, this central assumption behind data visualization, physicalization, and sonification is rarely explicitly addressed or critiqued. Because I think this is not really the way how we make sense of environmental information. You could say that, you know, all these things that I talked about are redundant, but in fact they are not. In reality, we always triangulate information, and if all the different clues that we get from the different senses point into the same direction, then it reinforces our interpretation and our sense of causality. But if there's a contradiction, we may suspect that something else is going on. And we do remember situations like that where that was the case. You know, it was not so long ago where, you know, suddenly something felt off about our environment, about our cities, that, you know, all these kind of different observations, how the cities felt different during pandemic lockdowns in sometimes very surprising and unexpected ways. Back in 2020, we also did a pandemic mapping project in Berlin, where we mapped the changing soundscapes and worked with radio programs and sound installations and listening walks in public space. And it's really interesting now to go back to this after all that time and see this, because it's really very much an issue of multisensory sense making or reasoning. So, but going back to kind of more artificial representations like we have them in visualization, there's also a reason to go for this kind of redundancy. This is the famous Montessori method, where children learn how to learn the letter shapes by having these sandpaper letters to give them not just visual, but also tactile and kinesthetic information about the letter. They also phonetically verbalize them, so you have all senses together. And this is very much in line with how learning still works. So the question is like, why do visualization and physicalization really ignore that and go for this kind of unique mapping approach? With Laura Perovich and Bernice Robowitz, experimental psychologist, we worked on a project for 1 year. It took us a while to get this paper published, but finally we made it into CHI, where we are looking at the way how people touch data physicalizations. And we do this using a very analog method. We spray the object with an invisible tracer substance and just let people interpret it based on different questions, like figure out how they use the sense of touch when they interpret the data that is embedded in these kind of stimulus objects. And we had a large number of those. And then you put them under UV light and you see the traces of where they touched. It's very sensitive. It's also very, very tricky to get it right, but it's a very interesting technique. And this also, when we started interpreting these traces, we also see that we very quickly get to the limit of this unambiguous coding approach, because the traces show a lot of features that are not easily to code in a systematic way. But if you're open to kind of interpretation, you get much more information out of them. And for me, I'm always very interested in this connection between visualization and traces, physical traces. On the other hand, there's a certain kinship. I mean, one is artificial, the other one is natural or accidental, but yet we kind of see the correspondence. But unlike the visualizations, the traces always have this kind of multisensory polysemic quality rather than monosemic quality. They always have like multiple features, always speak to multiple senses. And there's this, I have this book coming out at MIT Press this fall on this approach that I call autographic design, which is about self-inscribing processes like physical traces. And it's a method to really frame and show traces and present them as visualizations in order to make the process of data production more understandable and accountable. And so it has different steps. I'm not going to get into these details, but some examples. One way how this is very often used, and this is all based on observations of practices of citizen scientists or activists who use these very analog methods for the purpose of evidence construction, because you can kind of show certain things with material traces that people wouldn't necessarily believe you as easily with a digital data visualization. Of course, you can also lie with physical traces. That's absolutely the case. But it was very interesting during COVID also to look at these different physical visualizations that circulated, where someone coughed on a Petri dish and cultivated bacteria to show like whether masks are effective or not. Then people going back to this very almost like technique from the Renaissance, Schlieren imaging, where you would see the movement of hot air, also looking at masks. And this is where we got the idea for our tracer experiment, all these different ways of using these kind of simulated germs using UV tracer substances. Another way that can be used here is to visualize. Another purpose here is, and I think this is the important thing, is to visualize the origin of data. Data visualization, sonification, physicalization, they can only start once you have a data set. Then you can visualize it, and you can help people find patterns in these visualizations and try to interpret this. But very often in these kind of public controversies around data, the question is not about interpreting a data set. The question is always, where does the data come from? And what are the conditions, who collected it, and like what things were you know, abstracted away and not considered. And autographic design here is an approach to really get at the, you know, put the kind of origin of data in the center. So autographic visualization is not so much a representation of data, but it is an embodiment of data, or you could also say a measuring instrument for data. So it produces something that then can be more readily translated into data. So in a way, it embodies data in a more direct way. Yeah, maybe just to finish very quickly with an example of a very simple autographic visualization that I came across this summer. This is a glacier in Austria, the Pasterze. In the 60s, they built a funicular cable car down, so you could kind of go straight to the surface of the ice with this cable car. And when I was there in the summer and stepped out of the funicular, this is what I saw. So there was no ice, but there was this little sign that said where the glacier was in 1960. Then I would turn downwards and I would see this path going down. I would follow it. At some point, there's another sign that says glacier position 1965, but still not enough. Here we're in 1970. This is 1990. And this is finally 2005. But if you look at the little figure in the center of the image, so this is still very far away from this lake that only appeared in 2000, something like that. So in a way, you have a multisensory experience of a changing climate. That is, of course, you know, there's a kind of symbolic data which is on these little signs, but there's also your physical exertion of you know, hiking down to the head of the glacier. There's this kind of multisensory experience of the environment, and then once you are you're kind of sensibilized for that, you start seeing a lot of traces. You start wondering, well, is this maybe the line where the glacier stopped at some point? So you start looking at the environment in different ways. But again, you know, there is a interesting correlation here between the symbolic data of the signs and the physical experience. Like, for example, I wondered, how would my experience look like if someone would move these signs and put them in different places, and what would my conclusions about climate change be? So this is kind of a very interesting question about data origins and data representation and how they are connected with each other. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dietmar, especially for being really on time. Your talk, so Pedro, the stage is yours.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming. Thank you, Linz, for the presentation. Thank you, Dietmar. Good to see you, Sarah. That's the first time I think we're seeing each other. My name is Pedro Cruz, and I'm here perhaps representing the. I'm going to share my screen if I'm. Apologies, I have to grant access to my Zoom. Here we are. All right. So I'm here perhaps representing the most boring modality of the ones that have been presented so far, which is data visualization on the data in design. on the data in design umbrella of things, and nonetheless, I think I try to go about it in a way that is less straightforward than just mapping data to visual variables. So I usually do it in two ways. I either try to visualize whatever data we have without the fewer aggregations as possible, without not aggregating as much as we can, so avoiding statistical descriptions, for example. So we have data, we try to translate it in a more direct way. So if we have a lot of data points, I should be able to see a lot of data points in my resulting visualization. The other way is to represent this data through systems that convey some metaphorical meaning to these visualizations. So I just want to, in order to better inform everyone of my work and how I can contribute to the conversations, I just want to show you a couple of examples. So, for example, this is one of my first visualizations that utilize this sort of simulated systems. So these are a set of soft bodies that collide with each other. And this is about the decline of colonial empires and their landmass being lost to new countries as time goes by. And you can see these as if they were actors. They react to the data itself. So you have like mitosis, like splits. You have collisions between these former colonial countries. Collisions as if they were conveying some sort of competition. So so this is a simulated physics simulation, right? And we can see the explosions and certain independence periods, such as the 60s and the French. So this is one example that I thought would perhaps come closer to simulating into the visual and into the physical world, right? Another example that I have here that kind of embodies this concept of translating data into metaphoric ways into systems that not necessarily represent the data one-on-one. So most of you, so this is a smooth animation, so you can see it because it's going through Zoom, right? But everything is well interpolated. So I'm simulating the city. So this is the city of Lisbon. We're talking about traffic. I'm simulating the system as if it was an organism made of several blood vessels. So I have the number of particles circulating in those vessels proportional to the number of vehicles. I have the thickness proportional to the number of vehicles as well. And this is a shout out to the redundancy that Dietmar was talking about, right? That sometimes we can use it, and I used it in this case. And we have the shrinking and the growth of this whole system in a way such that is proportional or related with, that's more like it, with the velocities of this of the vehicles within each road, so that if a road is above the average in terms of velocities, it's as if you could get to those places in a shorter amount of time. So I'm compressing the road, right? So if you find yourself during a rush hour, I'm going to distend, expand the city as if everything was farther along. So when you're looking at the city as a kind of a beating heart that expands and compresses, it's also a way of showing the rhythm of the city and the rush hours, right? Whenever you have a certain rush hour, it's going to expand. Another example that I have here that again uses this idea, this is for simulation, in order to represent cartograms. So here I want to portray the wage disparity in Portugal. This is data from 2020, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm sure that you're not familiar with the shape of Portugal, but this is a cartogram. So what I'm doing is that I have certain regions, and as I make those circles grow inside those regions, I create a cartogram that has those regions distorted. And basically you can see where money is being allocated in terms of salaries in each of the regions in the country, right? So we have here the capital here, And we have the northern region as well. So those are the most popular spots in the country. And you can also try to see how much in terms of money is being earned by men and women, and also observe that from region to region and comparing the most remote regions with the one that are more urban, and you'll be able to observe that you have more disparities within the interior, for example, these regions, for example. Nonetheless, the point being that I'm using physical simulations here to portray data. And another physical simulation that also Dietmar referenced very quickly as a snapshot is my my tree rings simulation in order to show immigration to the US. Okay, all right. So for this, I implemented an algorithm or a system that simulates how tree rings grow, and so that for each country, I'm positioning a very small dash on a certain orientation, right? As if it was a cell in my tree. And as you know, as I make cells grow, they push themselves, right? They are pushed against the bark and they grow on top of other dead cells, but below the bark, right? So they have this pressure being exerted. Now, what I'm doing here is that I'm making more cells grow depending on a certain orientation, depending on where immigration is coming from. So that there is a higher probability that the tree, if this was the cross-section of a tree, that it would grow more in a certain direction, as if it had more light on that side of the forest, for example, it grows more in that direction. So I'm translating that into probabilities, basically, and that's what enables me to draw these natural
This is immigration to the United States, right?
This is immigration to the United States since the 1860s. And we'll have all right. So this would be the resulting artifact here. So that we have immigration coming, in this case, from Latin America, from Africa, Europe, Canada, Oceania, Asia, and the Middle East. And so these are the directions that dictate what's the probability of a cell from a European immigrant appearing on this direction. So, and it's basically a system that stacks all of these cells together. So, and I do it every 10 years, right? So you have the cross section of a tree, right? And this is, oh, and I'm out of time. All right. Okay, just to wrap it up.
30 seconds, you have 30 seconds.
I don't, wonderful.
On my work.
All right, just to wrap it up, I think, this is also something that I try to, as much as possible, to convey to my students. So for example, during just after COVID in 2020, I was teaching this information design studio for undergrad students. And I tried to have them work with quantities first, right? Instead of mapping the data digitally, I wanted them to work with, in this case, I suggested sprinkles, right? Sprinkles in order to, so if you have a certain quantity, you can measure that in weight and spread your sprinkles, right? You can do the same with ink. And you can also map quantities to lengths and wires, right? And manipulate those and play with their lengths in a way that can turn into an area, right? Like a spiral, no, a unitary, a one-dimensional, variable is going to turn into a two-dimensional. So, and these are some, so we have some students using, these are coffee beans. Yeah, coffee beans. And we had ink again, and the objective was for them to portray the attendance of protests for racial justice that had just happened in the summer. We had coffee, and they're using whatever they have at home because the classes weren't in person yet fully. Here we have coffee grounds, so we have coffee beans and coffee grounds. We also have students making several studies of what medium they can use. We have coffee seeds by Fiona. And then again, we go back to our links. And the most interesting one was, these experiments that Fiona did in terms of ink, because it spreads differently depending on the issue that you use, right, on the medium itself. And it gives you a different expression, although on average it has the same area, right, a similar area. Well, actually mathematically should have the same area because it's the same amount of molecules, right? So, basically I wanted them to experiment with physical quantities, right, before getting to abstract, right? So they have the data, they have measurements, and then they can map them physically. And that's the type of exercises that I like them to do in the practical space, regardless of whether we're doing it digitally or not. Thank you.
Okay, now I take revenge and take the time for me because I have to send me, so take the time.
I will.
It's all of revenge. Okay, so we move to a sort of other medium in a way that is data sonification, something about our archive. It's a short presentation. I will start introduce the archive and the work of analysis that we have done for a certain number of these cases, and then Sarah Lindsay from QDelft, co-author of the archive, will go through some of the examples. A few words about the data sonification archive. This is nowadays a joint initiative between the Center for Design, where everything started, and QDelft, the critical analysis lab, where Sarah works. And we started in 2020, also with the contribution of two graduate students here, Yuan and Ojian. They're still working on the archive, well connected, and starting in 2020, we launched in 2021 in January, and up so far we collected 470 cases of data sonification projects. And actually, we started to do that because there was nothing like that. So there was no place to go if we wanted to search and study cases of data sonification. Actually, there was no real data sonification world out there existing, codified as such. So what happened, and I'm very kind of proud of that, that it became like a kind of a center of gravity for the community that then recognized itself as part of this idea of data sonification. So it was, I like to think about that as an object that we designed that works, in the society has a role in a way in the society, gathering people together. So I like that idea of archives being more than just collection of cases. Anyway, so as for any archive, we started to lay down the metadata structure to collect the cases and catalog the cases and navigate the cases. There was we use something, and it's interesting because, of course, it's a little biased in the way we catalog them, because I used something that I was using in data visualization space to, catalog cases of data sonification. I'm not sure this is correct, but we applied some categories that were not specifically designed for data sonification. So, yeah, I think it's one way of merging these different modalities. But anyway, so we started to map them according to whether they were analytical in nature or more narrative. And then that's where also we started to design the data sonification campus. So we use, in a way, these categories that we defined in the metadata schema for also creating something that would help people designing data sonification, because as I said, it was not really a thing at that time, or was very much limited to the art community and people doing experiments on that. So, but if you want to be more intentional, there were no guidance, no guidelines for designing that. So we used some of the categories of metadata to create the canvas. And then on a certain point, we defined that there was a column in this data set that was really interesting, was this media mix. So at the beginning, we didn't really specify much about the different modalities, but there was an area where it was clear that some of them there were more than data sonification. They were using often visual elements. There were some of them that were really like kind of interfaces. So visualization was not the only modality. So on a certain point, we decided for the occasion of a conference to really dig a little bit deeper into this category and try to distinguish the way the different modalities were used. Because in fact, in some cases, in some projects, it was really important. The other contributions of the visualization was as important as the data sonification for the final result. And so we separated in a way the sensory modality, at least in two, because mostly it was about two different modalities together. So sensory one, sensory two, these are the two columns that were generated by the media mix. So the function that you saw, the interactive or not interactive. So this is a kind of a subset that we analyzed when we found cases that were embedding more than one modality. Usually there is one primary modality and then the other one follows. But there are also some cases that we kind of discovered that also interviewing the artists or the designers, that they conceived the project having both together in mind. It's not the most common case. Usually it's one guides and then the other one follows, whether it's visual or sonification. So we selected eight cases where both sonification and visualization were used, and then we analyzed that by sensory modality, if oral comes first or visual comes first, so both interactive, non-interactive, then the purpose is more analytical, more narrative, and then the topic, what it was about. This is the result. I will not go too much into detail, but there was something interesting. As I said, most of the cases was oral first and then visual, and both is like this purple here is a little less frequent, and then we had also some cases where visualization was driving, and then sonification came to reinforce the visual representation. What was not exactly expected is that, in fact, the ones that is oral first and then visual after, they're more analytical cases, or a kind of a balance between analytical cases and narrative cases. And in both, it's mostly narrative, and in the visual, is mostly analytical. So it was interesting in that possibility to see the cases. We did some other analysis, but I don't want to go much into detail here. But another interesting thing is that most of the interactive are both visual and audio, and then but there is a significant component of audio visualizations that are narrative and that are non-interactive nature. But this is the kind of analysis that we did, so you can look at that in the cases. Then I will leave the stage to Sarah to present some of those cases where the two modalities live together and contributes and create a synergy for the final result. Sarah, can you
Yeah.
switch your
Thank you,
screen?
Paolo.
Cases.
I take over your screen sharing. Yeah, thank you. So only 3 examples because we are very tight on time with the time. Then, of course, we can make this metadata public, and the archive is public. So you can navigate and search through the different categories that Paolo just illustrated now. So first example by Stephen Roddy, that is actually the person who coined the term embodied sonification. So we might want to talk about it later. Hopefully we have time. So he will be a great fit for this conversation. And in his attempting to build actually a browser-based framework for multimodal data analysis. And we chose it as an example because we feel it raises some questions, experiences it. So the first, the demo data set, let's say, is about COVID cases and very familiar visualizations of daily new cases, deaths, unfortunately, confirmed cases, confirmed that. And the person who wants to explore, to analyze this data, explore perhaps better, but let's say there is an analytical purpose there, they can also have the option to listen to the data. Oh, and here we will discover whether I clicked the infamous tick share audio, which I'm not sure. So let me share again, sorry. Yeah, I hadn't. Yep. So what happens if we click on sonify data in this particular diagram of the daily new cases? So I followed with the cursor, but even without the cursor, there was probably intuitive enough to understand. It uses a very typical code or metaphor in sonification, higher values, higher pitch. There are things to say about it. There's a famous experiment with visually impaired people who interpret it exactly opposite way. Here is also pretty straightforward. But things get trickier when we try to follow this curve. So there's no legenda. We don't know what the granularity is. It's a very different experience. Following example is completely, we are on a different way of narrating through data. And while it loads, I will describe it. This is a visualization, a reinterpretation of the famous Vignelli map of the New York City underground system, and the tracks, how they move in real time or pseudo real time data on train schedule when the lines cross. The map turns into what is in fact a musical instrument. So the two sensory modalities combined create a different experience, create an other artifact, in fact. And lastly, Renal is a meteorologist, he's a scientist, but he has this blog on disseminating the results of his research. So he works on climate and extreme events like El Niños. And he started this, so he uses data in his scientific analysis. Scientific publications are all visually based, uses data visualization, but then on this blog that is for dissemination, he launched the question, aren't we missing something by just looking at the data? So he also sonifies them. But what Paul and I found interesting of this example is that the visualizing the data and sonifying the data seem to respond to different goals, different intentions, in fact, because let's hear it a little bit. So data on the effect of El Nino on Eastern Australian rainfall generate music. This is music, is actually very pleasant to listen to, but is it the same experience of the data? Is it the same? Are they driven, the two representations, by the same intention of the author, or are easy communicating on different layers? And how do we reconcile these different experiences of the data in case we do want to reconcile? We could also feel at ease in the short circuit, but we don't know yet. That's why Paul and I explored the intentionality in using sound as another means.
Yeah, we lost you. We can't hear you well. Anyway, I think it's time is over, right?
3 minutes of.
Okay, perfect. So we switched to the last analyst and the
Hello?
presentation. Yeah, sorry, we lost you, but it's fine. So it's time is over. So we switched to the next presentation.
Yeah, I was closing. I hope you didn't. I hope you didn't lose the content, but just my final wasting time blurbing.
But I think almost full of Stephanie Polsky. Is it yours?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to do a bit of a hybrid presentation in the sense that I'm here but looking at our screen. What I'm going to do really is kind of do a bit of an alt change from sense to sensibility in this presentation, in the sense that we're going to be looking at what I'm calling the coloniality of data, or the way that data is embodied. And a lot of this research is based on my current book, The Dark Post-Human. Ask me about it later if you're interested. But this really is about the way that technology, in its abstraction, sometimes dehumanizes the subject, but also complicates the world, as it were. So we're going to look, in this case, in the Atlantic world. So the first thing I'm going to bring to your attention, some of this will be sort of data storytelling, and some of this will be about kind of data spatialization. So let's begin. So obviously what I'm talking about here in terms of this intersection is coloniality. This is the concept that refers to the interrelationship between European colonial history and its kind of aftermath. So how do we understand the kind of ripple effect in our imagination of the colonial period and what we're now calling the post-colonial, or if you like, decolonial period, and how this is really talking about data in the way that we sort of capture imagination in this way, representation, embodiment, and so on, and finally the deployment of it. So I'm going to take you sort of far back in a way to the sort of second half of the 19th century, but also something very contemporary. So this is a tall Abyssinian giraffe, which is now currently located in a Mediatek in Toulouse, Natural History Museum. So we've got the kind of media space as we've come to know it, and we've got quite an old giraffe. So I'm going to tell you the story of this giraffe, basically. And I'm going to tell you that this is actually based on Chanel Adams' work. But what's quite interesting about this giraffe is that it basically died in 1844. And during that time, it was actually consumed by members of the community in a saint's feast, right, over an Epiphany celebration. And after that, it was subjected to a 20-day dissection, which was a kind of triumph of science at that time. So why is this important? It's important because basically what's going on here is that this is a kind of data physicalization. And this giraffe, if you like, represents 5,000 specimens that are in the basement of such institutions, okay? And basically, this is tucked away amongst 1.5 specimens and objects in the reserve of this institution that effectively were the product of a frenzy of colonial collecting. And what we're not really thinking about is that this is a case of an abstract past, but also an abstract future. And what's happening to our giraffe today is that we're not talking anymore of the amnesia of colonialism. We're talking about this now as an artifact of rebranding these colonial collections as global heritage. But of course, the giraffe never went away. Let's keep going. Many of you may be familiar with these data sets, the granddaddy of data visualization, as it were. And what we're looking at here, of course, is again this map of this colonial world. And the setting for this, which is represented here, is the context of this presentation. So this presentation would have been made basically at a World's Fair in Paris in 1900. This would have taken place 6 years after the Berlin Conference, which would have effectively been about the carving up of Africa. And what you're seeing here is Du Bois, who comes to Berlin to make a study of sociology at this time as a young man, 1892, showing his wares, showing that he's taken on a kind of sociology and education, but the education that he is limited to is this exhibition of the Negro. And this is what it's called literally at this exposition universelle. But obviously what's going on is the translation of a kind of universal values, right? Roots of the African slave trade and the state of Georgia. This is a kind of distribution of bodies. What's seldom talked about is the distribution of these bodies that surround them. So in every data set, there is a kind of shadow of exclusion that we need to be talking about. Secondary to this, right? Slaves to free Negroes after a kind of, thank you. This is that 30-year period, right? Of a kind of idea of migration. Again, where are these codes? What is the echo in the data? So this is the amalgamation of race in Georgia, right? 44 Black. This looks like a kind of poll from elections we might see here, right? But actually what this is a kind of racial code left over from slavery that's echoing, yellow being the idea of passing in the society, the 16%, which then becomes in the photographs associated with this collection, which I'm not showing you, are the quantification of Black life as the talented 10th at this time. And what's interesting is that the photographs that are accompanying this data set do not name specific individuals, but rather type them. So again, this is this kind of legacy that we're seeing. I want you to kind of keep these maps in. The last sort of vestige here is land ownership. Again, how does one become an imperial power through land grab? So all of this is about territoriality. And we want to think about that when we think about the kind of history of the data. Again, the most famous data visualization of slavery, right? The quantification of bodies that can fit in this space. This is again a kind of famous echo. What you may not realize is that these bodies become the beginnings of capitalism and double entry bookkeeping, so that these bodies directly relate to these. This is a kind of symbiotic relationship that actually creates realities on the ground. This is a kind of Bristol Museum, but this is in America. And again, if we go back to that, there is no distinction between the worlds of travel. They are completely integrated with one another. I can say more about this, but will tell me how much time we have on that. We can go back to that. 4 minutes, let's keep going. I'm going to go into the detail. Now we're going to my favorite topic, algorithms. And what's interesting is that Jefferson, who is one of the founding fathers of this country, basically creates his own kind of formulas scientifically in his kind of most famous work about the founding of this country, about how to select four bodies, as it were, to create, again, that 16%, we talked about that in the last slide, 3/16 as no longer mulatto. So this is a kind of way in which this country is kind of literally engineered through these data sets to reach the equation of a white supremacy that we are, again, in the last several years, kind of grappling with a legacy of this kind of determination. And then it's again about circulation, who gets to circulate and with whom in these things, so that every part of this visualization, this abstraction, becomes, who is this body and how is it colored? What is coloration? What is abstraction? What is aggregation? Going? Lastly, where we are today, the breeding project of the Gaffian Empire. And why am I calling this the breeding project? Is because we're moving beyond bodies. We think we are, but again, the bodies are in the echo, right? So when we have this kind of map, this is again, this idea of a territorial land grab that we're seeing from 1900 to 100 years later. The imagination is still evolving toward this idea of how to kind of centralize power, centralize belonging, and centralize influence. But what's more interesting, perhaps, and I want to name check tactical tech, which is all the stuff that you're seeing around you. These are their images about how to talk about this. And what is being bred in these petri dishes is the next generation. And the bodies that they're considering are the AI body, the robotic body, but also the advertising body. They're also interested in the idea of advertising attention and so forth, but it is again about these kind of containments. And I'm going to bring you back to the first slide, this slide, to show you the kind of echoing of the imagination. So we think that we're dealing with a kind of digital understanding of how we organize information, how we organize data, but in fact, where this kind of lineage, in a sense, has not been disrupted, and we're carrying on the same kinds of imaginary kind of properties into the way that we disaggregate and aggregate this category. So,
Okay.
oh, I went to, let's see what we can do. I wanted to just read a little bit. Somebody's working, give it 20 seconds. We'll see if I can get through this page. But I wanted to talk about the Jeffersonian principle, which is haunting us to this day. Thomas Dick argues that Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, if you want to see the equations for yourself, please go, should be read not only as a work of natural history, hence the draw, but equally as a work of statistics. Jefferson was not only interested in managing life, but also forecasting it. America's natural resources and native inhabitants required evaluation to analyze and project how they could be transformed into wealth through their controlled circulation. It says that Jefferson uses statistics to envision how the world's first settler colonial state ought to manage the populations to safeguard the state's vitality and long-term survival. Numerical data becomes the stuff of life, as almost everything is put to numbers. Almost everything is measured and weighed in his account of Virginia.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
So that was an incredible amount of knowledge to digest. Questions, like comments from the audience here on the relationship with different modalities. Then maybe after those questions, we go back to the panel and same order, we leave some space for comments. Questions, comments from the audience? Curiosity, anything you want to say? So I have a question for you, if nobody else has questions. I heard you talking about a concept that you didn't present today.
All right. Yeah.
That I think is interesting in this context. That is this idea of data positive.
Yeah. So that's that's the first assignment of my graduate students in Information Design Studio 2. And it's tied with that idea of direct visualization. So the name of the first assignment is called Data-Posit from Positioning. Also playing with the data, with the deposit thing, which is about doing a fewer aggregation. So you have your data set and you're going to project it into the visual space and do as fewer aggregations as possible. It's as if you, again, we're thinking about your data as being physical and you threw it into the wall and see how it sticks and what stayed there. So that's the first assignment. And then from there, we actually go to in more traditional ways. From there, we go into a dashboard of statistical measures of the data set. Then we go to a single visualization that shows it all. And after that, we go to interaction and storytelling, right? Or motion, right? But we start with, trying to extract initial cues on what we should pursue from the first patterns that you see in that very basic projection of the data. Right? So it's as if, again, a data point is a data point. We are not dissociating that into two axes, for example, right? But we do have to give it a positioning space, though, right? So that's where the data positioning comes from.
I like this kind of physical gesture that you mimic, like this. Wow, this one is things on the wall. And actually, this is also how we measure if pasta is well cooked. So we put it on the wall. If it sticks is too much, then okay, doesn't get it. Enrico, I want to pick your mind here. So tell us something about what do you think from your perspective.
Oh, sir.
Yeah, I don't know when you joined the meeting.
Very recently.
Okay, so what is your, that's better probably. But what is your idea of this? Is there any space for making those modalities converge? If that's any of that, I think we may do that.
Oral and visual.
One or visual
Or something else.
Whatever. As much as possible, all the different senses. Is that what data embodiment is about?
I think I'm supposed to say something really clever, but I don't know what to say. So
I'm curious about your perspective.
yeah, I think when Sarah was presenting, couple of thoughts came to mind. One is I really like the last project that she presented, where the data was kind of like turned into music. And I like the idea, the general question of if I use different channels, is it possible that what I perceive in one channel is not perceivable or perceived in the other channel? So almost like they're really complementary. It's not only it's not the same experience, but there are things that I won't be able to perceive if I use either one or the other channel. Does it make sense? And it reminds me almost like, as an example in visualization that I like to use, where, say, if you arrange data, a timeline, a time series with a classic line chart, you won't be able to see certain things that you can readily observe if you arrange the same data in a circular form. Right? Unfortunately, I can't show it. I don't have it here. I hope it makes sense.
We believe you.
It's true. And so I'm wondering if using different channels, you can actually perceive different things and different meaningful things. That's one idea that crossed my mind. The other is, I don't know how relevant it is to this discussion, but I really like the music idea, because I'm personally really interested in this idea that how do we use sonification as something that is in the background, but is still informative somehow. I have to say, most sonification, Sarah, maybe you tell me if I'm wrong, but most sonifications are pretty unpleasant to my ears. I can't really imagine people, unless maybe you're a nurse in a hospital, unfortunately they're tortured with beeps and things, and they kind of like filter out. But I'm wondering if our mind can kind of like sense that there is a background kind of music that is not unpleasant, but if something changes, that they would notice. So I'm really interested in this shift of attention in something that is in the background, but it might shift, but you only notice it when it does shift substantially, right? So that's another thing that came to mind.
There might be a conflict here, because one of the problems with that case, and Sarah mentioned that, is that technically the phenomenon behind it's a very bad phenomenon. It's not pleasant at all. But then you hear nice, pleasant music, and you may do that because you want that music to be accepted and people not to reject the sonification, but at the same time there is meaning. So you're combining a very pleasant music, a lot of data that describe a very bad phenomenon. Is that right?
I think I forgot to. I think when I'm talking about that idea in my mind, I'm thinking about specific applications where sonification is used by either one or multiple people in an environment where sonification is used for data monitoring, right? So they're supposed to carry out a number of different tasks, right? But if something happens, they should be aware of it, right? Or if they actually turn their eye and turn their ear to what is going on, they were like, oh, it's okay, I can keep doing what I'm doing. So I'm really interested in these kind of like environments where multiple tasks are happening at the same time.
So Sarah, this might be the case of the prototype that we developed,
Yeah, yeah, actually I've been working on this case for a few years, currently paused, but I'm very happy to resume the conversation around it. There is the topic of peripheral monitoring through sound or situational awareness in different settings. We were working with Paolo during my PhD for real-time monitoring of cyber attacks, for instance. Yeah. So the target was expert users in security operation centers of water networks or digital internet networks that were doing peripheral monitoring through sound, while they also do visual tasks. Another case is air traffic control. There's quite a good bulk of research there using sound. Mixed feelings, for me, stimulating because it's mainly a design problem. I actually wanted to mention that there is this continuous tension in sonification between artistic approach and scientific approach that tend to use abstractedly isolated parameters of sound, as Dietmar was saying, like as if we as humans could really isolate pitch from rhythm, from amplitude. I mean, as an experience, they come all together. So mapping as isolated dimension makes it very difficult to get a global understanding. But I think that in between these two, there's the designerly approach to use sound. And in this use case, I think it works. I was using personal, not only me, in literature is quite, it has been used before to use natural sounds versus music, because music has a lot of cultural strings attached. It's difficult to find the music that everybody likes or can understand or can use over a few hours of a shift in doing data monitoring. Natural sounds, and the metaphor was there's a storm coming and you hear it and you understand that there's the network is anomalous. There's an anomaly in the network. Then if the anomaly is malicious, then the storm explodes. Otherwise, there are these fluctuating anomalies. And the idea is that the operator reacts and goes to the analytical visualization, the familiar visualization, only when sound has attracted the attention enough. And the idea of using natural sounds, and then I will leave it to Dietmar, is precisely also what Dietmar was saying, that we have a very sophisticated experience, and we develop a capability over the years to decode sounds from the environment. But these skills are still, I think personally, rarely used in the design of new sonifications. I don't want to talk too much. Dietmar, you want to?
No, I was just wanted to add, because it's a super interesting discussion. I mean, one aspect, maybe a little bit contrary to what I emphasized in my talk, is that there is, of course, a case for very clear, very simple, very reductive mappings that sometimes improve the impact of something. And I mean, even what Stephanie presented, the story behind the slave ship was a visualization made for the cause of the abolitionists, and it was effective because it was extremely reductive, showing a technical drawing rather than basically appealing to kind of Christian morality and like all these other strategies that emotionalize it. And I think similarly in data sonification and visualization, with this kind of scientific, very simple approach, one thing that is very often forgotten are these like Japanese media art projects from the 1990s that kind of used all these sonification principles in interactive modes in very effective ways, like Toshio Iwai and these people, that had like a very, very simple premise, but worked very well. So but what I wanted to add also is that the story doesn't stop once you have made the mapping, because afterwards there's a lot that the designer of a sonification visualization has to do. In the visual sense, you have perspective, you have all these groupings. This has nothing to do with the mapping process itself. There's, like I said, there's a lot that's going on. The question is like, what are these maneuvers after the mapping that happen, let's say in sonification and physicalization, and like what does aggregation mean, for example, in sonification and things like that.
Sarah,
If I can just, sorry, Paulo.
go ahead.
Briefly, anecdotically, because in the lab where I am now, critical alarms lab, we mostly work with critical care, intensive care, and of course the issues of alarm. But we discovered in a recent study that actually alarms also have a very comforting role for patients in intensive care. And if they don't hear the alarms, they are at the same time scary and perceptually, physically annoying and a source of stress, but at the same time, they are very reassuring, because these people cannot talk to other human beings, and they communicate to the world through alarms. So if they hear the alarm, they follow their health status. And in this sense, silencing the alarms would not be the solution. So with sound, but I guess with all the entire perceptual experience, is not so monodirectional, as Linz was saying, I mean, there's not isolated parameters. The role of context and human perception in context is still largely unexplored in terms of design opportunities, but is very complex then to see how real people react.
Linz, any idea on how to bring back the body into this conversation? So what is that how do you think we may couple this type of work that you do with the data with visualization? I mean, you mentioned visualization as a way kind of to reinforce, to
Yes.
Go ahead.
Sorry. And I'm kicking myself. I didn't watch that time very well, because I definitely did not show the project to express how I went about translating a data set into movement. But was reflecting just on these questions of aggregation and different modalities of expression through the project I was working on called Data Sensorium. It became quite clear that categories needed to be aggregated because to dance, for instance, the data of every country in the world wasn't quite going to work, and that the resolution of data needed to be brought to a more elementary level. And that's what I was trying to get at with using logarithmic numbers rather than literal numbers. But I think this, it kind of echoes back, Pedro, with like this idea of what is like the simplest way. Just, it was a bit reversed because I went into clumping versus letting things be individual, but the idea or the effort of simplification for the modality was an important one. And I think through that then arrived at a place of being able to communicate through the body, the movement score, and how that was really important because, right, can we actually hear the pitch and the frequency of the ear? That's where it gets so analytical, and through trying to be as simple as possible, then the communication of the data set could be achievable. So really like lingering on this idea of simplification, returning to like a sound in nature that we've been training our whole life to tune into, and there seems to be some real value there, especially as we think about data embodiment in Paolo's sense of the term as more of a sensorium. That simplification will be key so that we can perhaps reintegrate these translations into a holistic experience.
Lins, have you thought about maybe expressing your working to modalities at the same time? So going with the body and sound at the same time?
Absolutely. And that is for sure the next phase where I'm at, realizing that while fantastic to get to a place of a movement score for a data set, the need to then bring in what I'd love to do is pull a metadata off of the vocabulary or the decisions of the choreography to then create a sonification or then to create a video projection layer that brings in the other senses. And I think that that'll be interesting. So in a way, like the data set now becomes the choreography and not the original data set.
That's super interesting. What about the body itself generating the sounds?
Absolutely. There's just a slight danger in like going into that motion capture place without the interjection of, well, what were those choreographic decisions? Because then we kind of go into just all in like movement as information, which is different from movement as data expressed, if that makes sense. But I think for sure, as long as there's a way to decipher, as long as there's like a scrutiny behind what's being sonified from the body, then I think it would be true to this data sensorium, data embodiment idea.
Thank you, Lins. And going back to the sonification aspect of things, and I have this question, which it's perhaps a dumb question. It's more conceptual slash a provocation, perhaps, on the sonification archive. Is it true that we don't have only sonified data sets, only the oral? Why is that?
No, we have some, right, Sarah? I remember some just audio traces. We have.
Yeah, definitely there are. Actually, if you visit the archive, all the cases that in the archive's homepage don't have an image, those are, but they have like a placeholder that says data sonification archive. Those are only audio, but this was a subset with mixed media.
Sorry, because I saw the cross references of categories oral.
No, this is just a subset of 88 cases. So we actually have 88 cases out of 400. So most of them probably are just one plant that is sound.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, there are three, I think, among these 88, but we didn't show. We had an example, but I mean, we're quite aware of time. They use artifact. The mixed media label is artifact, and there are cases that I particularly like, because the artifact, music box in one case, and in another case is like Tibetan bells. They are used to generate the sonification, but the artifacts are also made based on the data. So the size of the bells are actually an embodiment of the data set, and then they are used also to generate the sound. It's only 3 or 4 cases that we have in that of this type, but I feel particularly a connection because it's really an embodied experience of sound, like a musical instrument, in fact, that it's a resonating body.
And I really enjoyed that example that you showed on the subway example, where you had a system that basically generates the musical score instead of being a mapping of the data, of the amounts to pitch, for example. You had a system there, right? And that marries very well with my approach to systems in visualization as well. So instead of having that straightforward mapping, you kind of have, let's call it an instrument in itself, right? It's its own thing, as Paulo said, right? That generates that musical score without you having to directly map things. So again, it reacts to data, and I really enjoy that example because of that.
Yeah, in the sonification, let's say, official definition in the sonification handbook, there is a rather recent method that is called model sonification. Is basically you as a sonifier build a system, but then the sonification is generated from the system. It's not one-to-one mapping. Is rather really an interactive system where either the public interacts to generate the data, or is a self-generating system, like in the case I showed. And this is one of the artifact. In fact, the author calls this acoustic sonification. Stephen Barras has been experimenting. He's a very well-known scholar in the field. But I fear that all these types of projects really are trying to move toward overcoming at the end of the day is the Cartesian mind-body problem, right? I mean, do we experience sound as in discrete parameters? Pitch here, the sonification canvas also goes towards this direction, because can really pitch exist without being the pitch of a piano sound, or the pitch of a bird, or the pitch of a human voice? What is the container of this parameter? So all the projects that try to really overcome this divide, this ancient divide in visions of human experience and perception, are very attractive for me personally.
We have other experts here in the room. Melinda, Carmen, you want to say something? We know you work across modalities, so if you want to say something.
The question I kind of was
like a call to. No, it's not really a question. If you want to comment or say something about this topic.
about mapping.
Physicalization.
No, I mean
I see.
different modalities, synergies between different modalities, different ways of representing data, how we can make them converge.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about how creating a system so that scientists don't have literally too much going on all the time. You have to and that's the technique that I'm exploring right now. For figuring out how to do that. And yeah, I think the one thing that I've discovered is that until you actually get your data into your system, the data changes the system a lot. So you can design this theoretical system, but once you have data, so that's why it's really important to have tools that you can play with data in your design system. And for me, that's using like Rhino and Graphical, because once you load your data, it's really easy to modify your code based on what you see the data doing to your requirements.
These systems will have to be reparameterized from the beginning every time that we test them. So,
Yeah.
Testing process.
Iterative process. Elinda, do you want to say something? You may say no, but
No, I don't really have like a very sophisticated comment. What is really fascinating is what purpose to this article is to see all these like text of this separated groups, presentation of the different aspects and like revelate to see links between the different physicalization sensorial experiences, but for me, it would be how I relate those fields to each other. But this is where I am at now. So I took notes and yeah. So many it's nice to see all the stress, like they feel the same. Or they create other meanings or they resonate somehow like that.
yeah, it's just data connection. That maybe one goal that we can set for the future is to try to make something that where all these things try to converge, like an experiment or some, I don't know, project that we all together. So is that a way to put in the embodiment as Lean's presented, so body, movement, performance, audio, physical representation, visual, all together? What happens if we put 4 different modalities together? I don't know, maybe there are no examples of that, but maybe we can do it as an experiment.
Sorry, I like the embodiment because it's so nicely embodies all the presented fields of direction.
But it seems that there is no actual embodiment yet. It's not fully done, you know, in this sense of touching all different senses. And so, yeah, Lens is trying now to introduce sonification and perhaps visualization as a kind of there, but these are attempts. So, sonification has also a visual component, but they lack the physical or the body, of course. So, we're trying with. This might be a task for the future, you know, find a project where we can let all these things converge and see what happens.
And you know, if we're
In
looking
terms of
for
research.
we're looking for the conceptual undertones that we have across these works, I often talk about my work as trying to put data back into the physical space or data back into the world, because when you abstract, data itself, you know, it's what is data? You know, it's a sample of some phenomena and it's abstract in nature, right? So it's not of this world anymore. It's an abstract concept, right? So, and I think that to some extent, what we are doing is to try to put data back in the world, in our reality, right? Either through my metaphors, either through sonifications, either through immerse physicalizations or phenomena visualization, or either through performance.
Exactly. I found it really interesting when I started doing research on physicalization and HCI that the original researchers like Paul Dorish and Ishii, she did tangible way back 20 years now. And their original vision for computer action was to have this sense of embodiment. So it's coming back full circle.
Yeah.
And to go back and read those, that literature is really interesting right now because it veers, the research community veers so heavily towards software engineering and task. They were evaluating all projects task-based methodology. And now it's very deeply being expanded towards why. But because it's a big concept, it is very difficult to define. Most researchers in HCI are discouraged from discussing why using that research. So I think the fact that this is coming up now is really relevant, very exciting, because I think like Callum said, it's something that's going to take a lot of researchers together to create a scope of how we define it so that people can feel some sense of it's easier to use in your research, so that it's already been validated. You don't have to write a paper on why I use this word and why it's already been established, and we can just work from there. Yeah. So I think that would be defining embodiment and getting it validated in some way in our community. See if you want to work with PI.
Full circle is very poetic. Good that it's said.
Okay, I think we are kind of out of time. Thank you. That was really interesting. Thank you for all the panelists on Zoom. I hope to continue this conversation. And yeah, Lynn's shared a paper on that. Dietmar a book upcoming, and we are all working on different areas of that idea of embodiment. So let's find a way to stay in touch and create sort of maybe a group of pressure, for this this more holistic way of representing data. Thank you very much, and yeah, I know that you may have lost some of the questions here, but we'll try to summarize everything that emerged somehow, maybe in writing. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you. Very interesting. Bye. Thanks.